had an amazing success with it. We've posted over 100 letters all over the world, so people have definitely been coming and taking advantage of our pads and pens and everything. I'd like to thank Organico for having us all week. Thanks girls, everybody, all of you who work here, thank you for having us and for allowing us to do this in such a lovely setting, and we'll be back with that next year. The one thing I will say though is that our last collection is going to be at 5 p.m. this evening. After that we can't, so we'll cover that, we'll post the letters for today, but beyond today, the pads, the pens are still going to be here for a few more days, but you'll have to post them yourselves, if that's okay, because we'll all be in a slight state of collapse probably on Sunday and Monday. I'm really pleased that Alison is here because I found her book, unfortunately, too late for last year's festival, and I think it's so important because Literary Festival is about word craft and wordsmiths, but all the other craftspeople in West Cork make this county what it is and make this part of Ireland what it is. And there are so many sublime craftsmen working in this area. You only have to take a short drive and you'll come across a wonderful workshop with extraordinary jewellery and baskets and knives, and I just think it's really important that she's here to represent the incredible collection of West Cork craftspeople. So would you welcome please Alison Ospina.
Hello there, can everybody hear me okay? If you can't, I was going to say, we're going to look closer, I think the chairs are running out. It's great to see such a good turnout here today. But just to give you a little bit of background, I'm actually a crafts person myself, and in 2009 I wrote a book about chairmaking. This is what I do, and there's an example of my work as that chair there in the centre, moving chairs. And I thought it was going to be the only book I would ever write in my whole life. So it's a bit like Where's Wally? You can see all my family and all my dogs in the photographs in here. I managed to get everybody in it. I thought that was it, because they say write what you know, and that was something that I've been doing for 15 years, and so I felt, that was my one. But it's as probably the letter writers have found this week, once you start, you kind of get the bug for it, because it's a bit difficult to stop. So very soon after finishing the Green Chairs book, I started to think of ideas and things that I would like to write another book about. So I decided that there are such outstanding craftspeople in West Cork that it deserves a book, and that maybe I would write a book that simply profiled a few people that I considered to be maybe the best of the craftspeople in the area. And it was a very simple idea, that's what I was going to do. But as I went around and interviewed people, it gradually unfolded that the story was a lot more interesting than that, and that there was a real history to what happened in West Cork. And that it isn't what happened in the rest of the country, it's only what happened in West Cork. And I found that fascinating. Some of the stories were really funny, some of them were a bit tragic. It was a real surprise to me to know, as a craft person now, what had happened, 20, 30, 40 years ago, why we were at the place that we are now. As Denise said, West Cork is well known and has a really good reputation for arts and crafts. And I was discovering how that was about and who the first people were, first pioneers to come to West Cork. So that was my motivation. It was a story that had never been written down, but needed telling. And by interviewing people, this all came out of people's memories and boxes of things that they'd kept, cupboards, flyers and things like that, brochures. So when the book was published last year, I invited a curator to put together an exhibition with me. And so what you're seeing around here on the walls are the sort of materials that went with the exhibition. So we took the exhibition to Europe House in London, then to Farmley, Phoenix Park in Dublin, where the Queen was given a copy, then to Cork Public Museum, and then finally to the West Cork Arts Centre. So these are the display materials that then, obviously we were also exhibiting crafts, but there's not space in there to do that, so we just thought we needed to these materials. And as you probably know, there's a mini exhibition of crafts in the craft shop, which is just a few drawers. So that's just a bit of a background. If you do look at the exhibition, it's best to start there and go that way around. because that's sort of the beginning of the story. Okay, so that's just a little bit about who I am and why I wrote the book. I suppose the most surprising thing that I discovered is that back in the 1960s, when the first people arrived here, West Cork was a very different place. The 50s had been economically really difficult for the whole country, and even the previous decades have been difficult. And young people have been leaving West Cork, going abroad, going anywhere where they could find work and other opportunities. So West Cork was, I think it was described to me as a very grey place. The person who said that to me said, the buildings were grey, the people were grey, the weather was grey, it was a very grey place, and there wasn't a lot going on. So what happened in the 1960s really was, there was a bit of a movement in other parts of Europe. People, I suppose it could be lumped together as being called a hippie movement, but there were things like CND. People were very worried about nuclear accidents and nuclear war and things like that back in the 60s and 70s. There was a whole self-sufficiency movement. There was the self-sufficiency book. People were looking to, I don't know, get back to nature, escape from sort of global urban society. People were looking to sort of get away from it all, if you like. And West Cork was about as far as you could go to get away from it all. And what was interesting back then is that houses were very cheap, land was very cheap, because people had been leaving the area. There were a lot of derelict or semi-derelict houses. A lot of them had never had water, running water or electricity, so you know, they had been standing there empty for a very long time. So people began to come over, and the first person who historically, the first person to come to Ballydon was a woman called Krista Reich, and she came from Germany via Northern Ireland. And she was a potter, and that's Krista up there. You see mixing the mixing bowl in the picture at the top there, and at the bottom with the shillelagh stuff, the cosmos. And Krista came to Ballydon and bought a house for £200, and set up a pottery there. She also, you can see in that picture. I mean, I don't know how many people here are from West Cork, but. In the bottom left-hand corner of that board, you can see the flower house, which was in Ballydon. So she bought a house outside of Ballydon to live in and set up a pottery, and then she bought a shop in Ballydon, painted it with flowers, and bought a flower house. And that was there as a craft shop for quite a long time. In fact, you know, it was only a few years ago that it finally flourished. I think it became a Celtic craft, or it became a different craft shop. It had been a craft shop since the 1960s, since 1965. And of course, it was the only house that was sort of painted like that up in those days, so it was quite a shock, really. So Krista set up a pottery and invited friends, artists, colleagues, students, anybody to come over and work in the pottery during the summer. Now, what happened was that really took off. People came over and they go, wow, Cork is really fantastic, it's really beautiful, especially if they came in the summer. And some of them stayed. And gradually, a little community grew out of that. Friends came, they stayed. Some of you will know Lida May. She's from Ballydon. She probably would be the second person after Krista to arrive. She arrived at the end of the 60s. And actually, Krista gave the space to set up her own pottery. So she, you know, that was really the beginning of the development of the movement. I just wonder if there's a picture of Lida here somewhere. This board here is mostly pictures of people back in that time. Some of them contemporary, but for me, I met these people in the 90s, and it's fabulous to see photographs of them back in the 60s and 70s, so there's some great old pictures there. Anyway, so Lida May set up her pottery, and she invited people, and gradually the thing grew and developed, and a lot of people started to move out to West Cork. Now, there's one person in the book who I profiled, one of the artists, who's Rory Connor, who's a life maker. He's the only one who actually was born and bred in West Cork. And he remembers, he actually is Ballynicky, just up the road from here. And his father used to be Church of Ireland rector. And he remembers one day a big old ambulance, converted into a minibus type of thing, arrive at their house, and all these sort of hippies tumble out of it. And he thought it was the Roman emojis for Led Zeppelin. He was so excited, he was like, oh, you know. It was so different and so unusual. It's very hard for us to picture now what that was like, but you know, the like of that hasn't been seen around here at all, and so it was really unusual, and it made a huge impression on him, and I'm delighted that he remembers that, because it's a great story. Now, what was interesting is that the local community accepted these people. So, you know, what was happening in Ireland was very, very different. You know, people, there wasn't a lot going on in terms of music, people didn't dress in bright colours, people got married, and, you know, these kind of people were setting up all sorts of strange families where they would occasionally swap partners and they'd have children with somebody else, and, you know, they're in and out of each other's houses. It was a very, very different kind of society, and yet local people accepted them, because if they hadn't, it wouldn't have worked, you know. Now, a lot of the time these people were really short-minded, so they would make their crafts, and some of them were going to sell their crafts because there was quite a lot of tourists around, even in those days. Local people did buy them too, but on the whole, they made money in the summer. Also, a lot of them were very keen on self-sufficiency, and they had very good sort of kitchen gardens and things like that. So they had a glut of food in the summer. They might have kept a cow, a couple of pigs and things like that, but in the winter they often went very hungry. So there would be parties. So if somebody was going to kill a pig, for example, they would invite everybody round, and everybody would take away part of the pig, and that would be their food for the next couple of weeks. There was no electricity in most of these homes, so they didn't have refrigeration, they didn't have running water. You know, it wasn't easy to keep going in that way. So local people, somebody told me once that he went into a butcher's in Skibbereen once in the middle of the winter and asked for a bag of scraps for the dog. And the butcher winked and put a couple of chops in there and said, oh, the dogs would be happy with that, because he knew, you know. And I've even heard people say that they would eat from those bags of parati, you know, those bags of chicken cornflakes, you know, they'd use that for thickening soups and things like that. So they were very hard times. People had very, very little money. Also, there were very few cars around, so transport was a difficulty. A lot of people who come from cities had no idea how to look after a horse and cart, but a horse and cart was the only choice for transport. So they were having to learn how to look after animals, how to clean the tap, you know, all this kind of stuff. They'll tell you that now, and it's very hard to imagine, because these would be people who, you know, I've always known is driving around in cars and eating fairly well, you know. So it was very different times. So I suppose that answers the question of why did they choose West Cork. It was pretty unusual. The other thing is that at that time there was no contemporary crafts here. Contemporary crafts had started to become fashionable in urban centres around Europe. The contemporary crafts hadn't really got off the ground here in West Cork. So the old crafts had started to die out, so the basket makers, shoemakers, people who made functional crafts. Those traditional crafts had died out, but there had been no beginning of the contemporary craft movement. So again, they were making things that nobody else was making. There was no competition. So you know, that was also an important part of it, I think. Yeah, so they made a living making their craft. Now, a lot of people came who didn't know how to do anything like that, anything practical. So a lot of people came that didn't stay, because they discovered very quickly that a long winter's evening in a cold, drafty farmhouse in West Cork isn't quite as romantic as it seemed in July when the sun was shining. So a lot of people came and didn't stay. But the people who managed to stay were the craftspeople, because they had a way of making a living. Also, they're very practical people. They could do a bit of building, they could improve their houses, they could even light a fire. You know, they were sort of prepared for that kind of living, whereas other people who'd come from cities all over Europe wouldn't really have those kind of survival skills. So the craft people were the ones who really managed to stay and hang on in there. And a lot of those people who came are still here now. You know, they're still here now after all that time. So it's quite a fantastic achievement, because it certainly wasn't easy. What's interesting about what happened here is that at the same time in Kilkenny, the government decided to set up Kilkenny design workshops. They decided that there was a report done by Scandinavians in Ireland in the 1960s that said design in Ireland is appalling, it's abysmal, it's, you know, even their postage stamps are terrible. And that's got the Irish government thinking, well, you know, we can't have this. So they invited people from Holland, from Scandinavia, from various different countries to set up Kilkenny design workshops in Kilkenny, obviously. to get that whole thing going for Ireland. And that was totally different in that it was resourced, you know, the buildings were given, there was funding given, and the intention was to get craft started. But what was happening here was happening completely organically. People just arrived, people stayed, they invited their friends, and the community became very important. And when I interviewed people for the book, what everybody said was that back in those days, nobody had very much money, but everybody was willing to share, and that people shared their skills and their resources to the same. So they weren't secretive about how they did a certain glaze on a pot or something like that. You know, they shared that, and they would have workshops, you know, and invite people, give maybe a demonstration about surface decoration or something like that. But people were very generous with their time and with their resources, even though they had so little. And the sense of community was really important. That they were always with other people, they were always hanging out or whatever. You know, they were always at somebody else's house or down the pub. There was music, there was talk about art, talk about craft, and it was a very exciting time. From what people say, they were being quite innovative. They were making things that weren't really being made anywhere else, and it was a very exciting kind of a milieu to be an artist in. And that again became an attraction. So even more people came over, because even though they didn't have great communications back then, word did get out that this was going on in West Cork. And in fact, there were people who moved down from Dublin because West Cork was where the exciting work was happening. So, you know, I had to ask myself the question, how could Ballydehob be the epicentre of anything? It's really hard to imagine. And yet it really was, you know, so that was a huge sort of eye-opener for me. I could never imagine that. Now, a few people who came over had been involved in organisations in the UK and in Germany and in Holland, and they decided to set up a cooperative, because what was happening was they were selling their work here locally, but it wasn't getting outside of West Cork. So they opened a shop called the Cork Craft Guild in Cork City in 1972. And that became a really important shop, because not only was it selling crafts that were made in West Cork, I think it was being supplied by 700 people in its heyday from all over the country. Everyone was talking about the Cork Craft Guild, and it was a really successful shop. And after a while they opened then another one in Dublin. And unfortunately the Dublin one was their downfall, because the expenses were so high. Both shops shared a bank account, you know. And although the Cork one was very successful, the Dublin one, eventually they both came down because of the costs in Dublin. But there are stories about how TDs, local TDs, would fill up the back of their car and drive up to Dublin and deliver ceramics, you know, because it was Christmas Eve and the shop needed, you know, people were all helping, people were all fighting involved. And I think that's important, that it wasn't a subculture within a culture, but it actually spread out and became important to the whole community. The other interesting thing is that the community was becoming very educated, so the community would know which potter had made your teapot, or, you know, did you get your basket from so-and-so in Shannon, or from your man up in Camola. You know, they were becoming very educated too. And it wasn't just tourists that were buying the crafts, it was local people who were as important a market as tourists. So that's something I wouldn't necessarily have thought. The other organisation that was set up was the Society of Cork Potters. So because the Cork Craft Guild was so successful, the ceramicists, there seemed to be a lot of potters, more potters than anything else. They set up their own small group, and that became quite a force in itself. They would invite people from other parts of the world to come and give demonstrations and teach different techniques and things like that. So that again became quite important. So these two organisations were both existing between the 70s and the 80s mostly, and they brought a lot of interest to West Cork, and a lot more people came as a result of that. So these days, I mean, West Cork has the second highest concentration of craft people in the country. The highest is the area around Dublin, but being the second highest, I think there's about 400 to 500 craft people in Cork County. But almost all of them are in West Cork. You find very few of them in North Cork, and not so many in East Cork either. So, yeah, as a result of that, there were people in the government. There was a minister called Justin Keating, who recognised the importance of what was happening, because it was providing employment in rural areas. It was actually creating employment in rural areas, and that was obviously an important consideration at the time for employment. So support started to be available, so there were grants given to people to do what, maybe re-roof the pigsty so they could turn it into a workshop. There were lots of small little grants available to people, and they were quite easy to get. You'd get a visit from somebody who would say, and what do you need now? Okay, you could do with some shelving. You want to say, yeah, okay, what, £1,000? Okay, grand, okay, It was pretty much as simple as that. So people felt that I suppose that they were acknowledged that what they were doing was important, and that they did actually get quite a lot of support from the government for things like that. Now, obviously, things have changed a little bit since then, and they've changed in two ways. I suppose right now we have the advantage of the reputation that developed in West Cork because of those pioneers, and I feel that in writing the book it was very important to acknowledge those people, because unfortunately I didn't ever get to speak to Krista. She died 2 weeks before I managed to track her down. She was living in the UK at the time, and she left an archive. And in fact, you'll see that the profile of Krista Reichler is written by somebody called Patricia Howard. She left her archive to a colleague and said, make sure somebody writes about this, it's important. And I had no idea that was going on, and she had no idea that I was planning the book. And so I asked Patricia to then write Krista's story, so that's the first profile in the book. And sadly, John Burling also died before I had a chance to speak to him as well. And he had been one of the very earliest artists, I suppose, really here. And a lot of those people were very prolific artists. So they didn't just make ceramics, but they also were printmakers, they were illustrators, they were painters. That a lot of them had quite many skills rather than just concentrating on one material. So John Burling, probably some of you here would know John. Yeah, very important artist. So we have the legacy. We have the fact that local people worked so hard. And partly the reason the West Cork Art Centre was set up was because local people recognised the importance of what was going on and embraced it, and decided to, this is good for the region. So they worked very hard to get the funding to go to set up the West Cork Art Centre, and the West Cork Art Centre was very important for people back then as a place to exhibit and even to sell. I think they used to do a Christmas craft fair in the Art Centre back in the 80s and 90s. So I guess my main point really is that it's thanks to those pioneers from the 60s and 70s that West Cork has the reputation that it has, and yet that had never been acknowledged. Because to some extent, I think it was considered, well, that was a bunch of blowings, that's nothing to do with it. But actually, it turns out that it was a lot more complex than that. It was to some extent a bunch of blowings, but they were supported by the local community, and it became a movement in itself. And another very interesting thing that's developed out of it is that I think that a West Cork aesthetic has developed, and that is based on the fact that people came from Germany, from the UK, from Holland, from Scandinavia, even from North America, with different ideas of how to make things and how to make things beautiful. But they were all inspired by the landscape. They all had the same input, a beautiful, beautiful landscape. And in the 60s, in, say, urban Berlin, art was very black and spiky. Well, there was no way that art that's made in West Cork was ever going to be black and spiky. So, to some extent, there came a point where they all agreed as to what was beautiful. And an aesthetic developed, which is almost recognisable because it's such a mix, it's such a cultural mix. People brought ideas from wherever they came, from their own backgrounds and from their own college educations very often, and that all went into the mix. They shared their ideas, they shared their skills and their expertise, and what developed was something quite special. Okay, so I'm just going to read something, and then I will wind up. And if anybody's got any questions, then you'd be very welcome to ask them. I'm just going to swap glasses. So this is just the beginning of the conclusions chapter. Between 1961 and 2000, a West Cork aesthetic emerged that was inspired by the landscape and created by the artists who came here. From the earliest days, the movement has been nurtured by the local population who seem to understand and appreciate it quite instinctively, despite being very different from anything seen here before. Because of that acceptance and recognition, the artistic community has thrived and prospered in West Cork, and excellent, innovative craft has become an important part of the region's cultural heritage. I mean, really, that says it all in a nutshell. I could have just read you that and not given you it to you. Okay, so that's the story, that's the history. If anybody's got any questions, please fire away.
Can I just say that I came here in 1960 on a holiday, and part of that holiday I was in Glengarriff, but we went out on a day trip. Some little local person decided to have a minibus and run tours.
Yes.
And there were mostly Germans in, and myself and my father. And we went out to Castle Hill, and I will never forget, it was green and brown, everything flaking. It was awful.
Yeah.
It was so awful that years later I'm a social worker, and I came down here to work. And at that time I had the whole of the city and county, just me. And I had to visit Castle Haven, and I dreaded visiting it. Not the person I had to visit, but the thought of that town that it was so awful.
Yeah.
Now a change has occurred,
Absolutely.
but we'll tell you how awful it was
Yeah.
at that time. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
There's no image of it today.
No.
That's what, despite our cries about the Celtic tiger.
It's very hard for us to imagine it now.
Oh, yes.
But this is what a lot of people said. Yeah.
And that shop in Cork did wonders.
Yes.
Oh yes,
Yes.
there were beautiful things in it.
It's
Beautiful.
great how everybody remembers it so fondly.
Yes.
You know,
It wasn't big, it
Up
was
and on and
beautiful.
no, that's right. Yeah. Anybody else?
I worked for both Esther and Nora Golden on the
Really?
buildings.
Wow.
I lived in the back of the firehouse.
Did you?
50 pence an afternoon for hugging clay from one barrel to
Oh,
another.
of course, yes. Yes.
I do remember Krista was delighted to actually sell some pottery to the local farm.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it wasn't all playing sailing.
Not at all, no.
It was
It's
a
hard time.
notorious garden, belly the hog and shouted to
Yeah.
anybody who came into
Yeah.
their door.
Yeah.
I have an archive of black and white photographs of
Do you?
the pioneers of the 80s.
Oh God, I should have found you. I should have found you 2 years ago. I was writing the book.
In the library, actually.
You gave it to the library?
No, I exhibited them in the
Oh, did you?
library.
Oh, okay, yeah.
She thought it was interesting.
Well, I would have been. I'd have been there.
The horse farms
Yeah.
are still in this book.
Yeah.
And I think you haven't mentioned that there was a modicum of Protestants. Who hadn't been brainwashed by the RC church school system in
Yeah.
West Cork. It was noticeable. You could send your children to a Church of Ireland primary school,
Right.
which you still can.
Yes. Yes. Well, Rory Connor's father was the rector of the church at Oakley, which and a lot of people would go to him if they were really short of money or hadn't got a meal in front of them.
He baptised a child in a stream the other side of Bantry once, next to a communal house.
Yeah.
I mean,
There are so many of those kind of stories. It's I really have only put the tip of the iceberg of what I heard into the book. You'd actually need a box set, I think, to tell the whole story. But yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking how important Christine's craft shop has been to craft people over the
Absolutely.
years. I mean, consistently, she has given them an outlet where they may not have had their own outlet. For many, many, many years. I don't know how long she's been there.
Well, she's in the book. She's in the book. That's been very important because one of the things that Christine did that other people didn't do was she would buy things off of you.
Right.
So if you had just made something and she liked it and she felt it was well enough made, she would buy it from you. Whereas everybody else would take it and say in return. And you'd eventually get the money 6 months or a year later. Christine actually, you know, so she, and also she sticks to only Irish craft. I mean, she has mostly West Cork, but she has only Irish craft. So yeah, she opened, I think, in the 70s. Yeah, she opened at that time. And so what she was doing was, very important.
Down the Castor Road, I think. I remember that.
Yeah, she used to be in that one in the corner.
Yeah.
I have a photograph. I think it's, I've got a print, I think, in the book there of her when it was there. It was
Yeah,
of her.
yeah, when she was growing up.
Very important. Actually, that's very good. Okay, well, we'll leave it at that then. Thank you very much.